If it's Friday, more poll numbers are showing Republicans had the advantage on nearly every issue they thought would deliver them a midterm victory. But it's the Democrats who now have the advantage on the issues that may matter more in November. Plus, the Justice Department weighs an appeal after a judge rules against the government's emergency request for speedy access to documents at the center of the criminal probe surrounding former President Trump and his team. And a gruesome discovery in northeastern Ukraine as officials end up finding hundreds of bodies left behind by Russian troops as they fled Ukraine's recent counteroffensive. Happy Friday and welcome to another episode of Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd. So what if I told you Republicans were winning on all the issues they targeted coming into this campaign cycle, but yet are facing a real possibility of coming up short in these midterms? That's the reality the GOP is living in right now, and that's because the political reality has changed, particularly after the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, and of course with the recent return of former President Donald Trump to the headlines and on the campaign trail and the investigations. Some Republican candidates are clearly aware they both have a problem, both with Trump and abortion, because you can now see it in their actions on the trail. Take Nevada Republican gubernatorial nominee Joe Lombardo. He's now saying that if Republicans in Congress passed a federal ban on abortion, he'd fight it. Then there's New Hampshire Republican Senate nominee Don Bolduc. He did a full 180 on Trump's false claims that the 2020 election was stolen from him. Take a listen.
I signed a letter with 120 other generals and admirals saying that Trump won the election, and damn it, I stand by my election. We, live and learn, right? Spent the past couple of weeks talking, every party. And I have come to the conclusion, and I want to be definitive on this. The election was not stolen.
Well, our new NBC News poll last month was the first real sign that Republicans were winning on their key issues, but not winning where it matters for November. And we've got some new NBC polling coming out Sunday. Stay tuned. New York Times Siena poll that's out today shows those trends continuing from that poll that started it all a few weeks ago. The GOP has advantages over Democrats on some key issues that they wanted to have the advantage on the economy by 14 points, illegal immigration by 14 points, crime by 10. These have been the three tentpoles of the Republican campaign message. Find any television ad in just about any battleground House or Senate race, and you'll see those three topics. And when it comes to the president's policies, more respondents said Biden's policies have hurt them personally more than they've helped them. Again, on paper, should be a good sign for the GOP come November. And yet, Republicans are narrowly trailing Democrats when voters are asked who they'd support in November, at least in this Times poll. Why? Because as we said at the beginning, the party has two big anchors weighing it down. On abortion, 62% said they strongly or somewhat oppose the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. The same 62% also say abortion should always or mostly be legal. And then on the issue of Donald Trump, a majority say the former president's actions after the 2020 election threatened American democracy. And he also remains less popular than Biden. So we mentioned the governor's race out in Nevada. Nevada probably the swingiest of our swing states these days. And it's where we find my colleague Guad Venegas. He's on the ground in the crucial Washoe County, Nevada, after attending a rally for Republican candidate Joe Lombardo last night. I believe it was the Virginia Republican governor and perhaps future presidential candidate Glenn Youngkin who was campaigning with him. And Guad, you've been watching this on the ground. Have you sensed a shift, both really with not just Lombardo, but in the Senate race with Adam Laxalt as well?
Well, Chuck, we've been talking about this campaign in Nevada, right? We know we haven't seen a shift with the Laxalt campaign yet, but when it comes to Lombardo, Chuck, we talked about this. He has been a much more moderate candidate. I think he's aware of where Republicans are. He's aware of where voters are. Nevada's so unique, Chuck, because you look at the numbers here with registered voters, the number of registered voters that keeps increasing is the nonpartisan ones. So both the Democrats and the Republicans know that they have to win over these voters. Now, let's go to Lombardo. Lombardo yesterday spoke with Youngkin, and it's very strange because for moments you think that he's a traditional traditionally Republican conservative candidate, and then he will make other comments that makes him sound moderate. So it's very interesting. You and I spoke the day he won the primary to become the Republican nominee in Nevada, talking about how moderate he was and how he was going to help the Republicans win these voters. Now, we know that Glenn Youngkin was able to swing the state. He flipped a state that is in Virginia, make it a Republican state. Yesterday, Youngkin said he wants to do the same in Nevada. He wants Lombardo to take that playbook and talk about issues like education that he thinks will carry some of those voters over. Here's part of what Lombardo said yesterday when speaking at one of these rallies. You mentioned you want to be the education governor. You want to take that away?
I want to take that from you.
So when we look at what happened in Virginia, parents' rights and critical race theory are being touted as some of the reasons why you won. Can you mention how those issues affect people in Nevada and what your thoughts are?
It's the same issues across the United States. We have to be wary of those issues. And when you talk about social reform curriculum, that has no place in the school environment. That has to be done at home with the parents.
If conservatives take over the Senate and pass a nationwide abortion ban, will you fight against the federal government and work to uphold Nevada's statute?
Yes, I will. It's the vote of the people within the state of Nevada, and I will support that. That is an issue that doesn't need to be in politics.
So he wants to protect abortion rights in Nevada, but he's against teaching critical race theory. He's playing both sides here. There's where Lombardo is. Chuck, quickly, I do want to say he is separate from the rest of the other Republicans here in Nevada who are much more right-wing and have been playing to the MAGA politics.
It's been interesting following him. I'm just curious. You know, Nevada is one of these places that, you know, if our economy gets a cold, Nevada gets the flu. Cost of living, abortion rights, you know, when you talk to voters, they have a big chunk of those independents. What is the driver?
Chuck, voters in Nevada are upset, like in other parts of the country. And a lot of them tell me there's two things that really upset them. One is the lack of bipartisanship in the state and the fact that the number of nonpartisan voters has increased. That's proof of them being angry at both parties. And the other one, they're upset at how much they're paying for gas and other things. Housing is one of these things. But yesterday when I asked some of the supporters, they said, look, everybody's upset that we're paying so much for gas. So the leadership isn't working hard enough for us to pay what other states are paying for gas. So, yeah, that's something that has them upset. And Lombardo and other Republicans think that voters are so upset at the current leadership that they will be willing to give the Republicans a chance so that they can improve their economic situation, Chuck.
Guad, well, you are right about this. Everybody's upset. But it's not about the same issues. That's what makes this so unique. Guad, in Nevada for us, Guad, thank you. So joining me now is a terrific panel, supersized, if you will. Eugene Scott, national political reporter for the Washington Post. He's fresh from the campaign trail, is my NBC News colleague, Dasha. We got Democratic strategist Xochitl Hinojosa and Republican strategist and former White House political director Sara Fagen. Eugene, what I find interesting is that you can make a case both parties are actually succeeding on the issues they're trying to succeed on, and we're just not sure where the country's going to go.
Right, and that's why so many people focus on independent voters, because these are voters who are looking at things a little more nuanced, aren't really falling in line with party lines. And that's been the trend for a while when you look at independent voters. And whether or not Democrats or Republicans are going to be successful in winning those independent votes, I think it's going to depend on which states and which elections we're talking about.
Dasha, does it really depend? Do you feel as if it depends on the geographic area you're covering on whether you hear more about some of these, you know, democracy or abortion rights versus cost of living and crime?
Yeah, absolutely. But the thing is, I'm hearing about both of them a lot. I wouldn't have said this in the primaries, but right now I will. I think it's now a politics of policy rather than a politics of personality. You know, just a few months ago, it was really, especially looking at Pennsylvania.
Fair point. It was all about the guys.
Right. It was
Fetterman and Oz or whatever, yeah.
Right. And now people are like, no, these are the issues we care about, and that's what's driving us to the polls. And I will say, I think the abortion rights issue, look, it shook the ground for a lot of people. And I'm not talking about just Democrats. I am talking about independents. And you hear that when Democrats are using this language that is very clearly trying to reach those voters. They're talking about it as a government overreach issue, as a freedom issue. In Kansas, the first sort of big flag here that this was going to be critical, the group fighting for abortion rights was called Kansans for Constitutional Freedom. You wouldn't think that that's a group of Democrats, but it was.
You know, Sarah, our pollsters said something interesting as we were getting ready for our poll that we're going to debut on Sunday, which is like, it's not that, let's not talk about waves. We have cross currents, right? And we may have some unusual results, but it may not actually be easy to explain in like one typical sentence that we're used to.
Yeah, I think there's certainly some evidence that suggests that there's the red wave is going to be, you know, much smaller than people thought.
You still want to believe there's a wave? You're still there?
I think that there could be. I mean, look, you have to look back at 50 years of history and the fact that the economy has played such a dominant role in elections. And if I was on this show earlier in the week, I may have been a little bit more boisterous about Democrats' ability to thwart that. But I think that inflation number that was released yesterday really was a punch in the gut to Democratic's chances. I also think, candidly, Donald Trump has been a little less in the news the last week. And I think August was a tough month for polling for Republicans. It sure seems to have rebounded last week in what I'm seeing.
Xochitl, what's your take?
I think that Republicans could have walked away with the Senate. I don't think so anymore. I think in many of these primaries, you saw Trumpism, and Trumpism does not win you independent voters in some of these key battleground states that Joe Biden won. You're also seeing President Biden's approval rating tick up, and I think that is because he is addressing some of the issues that people care about, like inflation, like gas prices.
But all of the increases are just among Democrats.
They are among Democrats, but at the same time, Democrats actually have some real accomplishments that they can now show for and talk about, which they are talking about. I also think that in some of these states, Democrats are trusted compared to Republicans. These are people that are well known in the state that have established themselves versus a Republican candidate that seems to be more Trump-like than anything else.
Ask this, is there new information that could matter? We had one piece of new information you pointed out there. What do you guys think, Eugene? Is there a new piece of information we don't know? Right now, some could say maybe it's an indictment of Trump. I think now that we know that's going to be, if it happens post-election, given what we have with the special master, maybe it's your energy bill that comes in October. You know what I mean? What's an unknown that we don't know yet?
Investigations, maybe local news doing investigation on candidates. To your point earlier, a lot of these Republican candidates are unknowns, people who aren't very familiar to their electorates. And so now you're seeing some vetting that didn't happen before that could, make some independent voters say, this is not the person that I want to, take this position.
Right. And some of these Republican candidates that are farther right are not the candidates that the establishment invested in, right? So there wasn't as much vetting. And I think between abortion and these the MAGA outcome from the primary, that is creating some challenges for the Republican Party. And I do think we could see more than one October surprise with some of these candidates. Even in the primary, the January 6th photos coming out from Kathy Barnett, we could see more of that sort of the social media scrubbing, all of that rising to the surface in the coming months.
Chuck, I think the one thing that I question is there a paradigm shift happening based on, sort of where political science has been? And that we're in a place now where both parties are so unpopular. Right. We've had 7 out of 8 change elections in a row. This will be in
four straight midterms, right? I mean, which, by the way, we'd never had 4 straight midterms where we had flips before.
Right. Yeah. And in the last 4, hundreds of House seats that the state legislative jurisdiction moving. So I do wonder if that people are so fed up with politics. Yeah. Democrats think they have a good chance. Republicans think they have a good chance. The reality is people don't like either party, unfortunately.
It's funny. There's this one voter anecdote from the Times piece that sort of, it was a woman from Racine, Wisconsin, and she's like, she's had to skip vacations. She's changed her lifestyle. She's driving less. She's not going to the movies. She thinks Democrats are handing out too many government subsidies, and she's voting for Democrats because of abortion. right? Now, how many of those voters exist, right? If we know the answer to that, you would be able to tell me what the midterms are going to be like, right?
Exactly. And because Roe happened in June, I do think it will mobilize our base and it'll mobilize independent voters. We obviously saw that in Kansas as well. But the reality is how many will turn out because of that issue and how many will turn out for Democrats. And if Democrats don't actually spend the money to turn these folks out and make real investments in some of these communities, then they won't. Then they will stay home like they did in Texas, and that seat flipped from blue to red in the Latino community.
Sarah, what would you tell a candidate to do on abortion right now? Because a lot of them have decided to ignore it. Don't touch it at all. And I've talked to some that say, ignoring it's a bad idea.
I think the thing to do, which is always the thing to do on every issue, is to say what you believe, and then. I
know that's crazy. What a crazy notion.
But more importantly, and then try to persuade people on it, because people will vote for you if they don't agree with you on an issue, if they think you're authentic, if
you're genuine about it,
and you have enough other issues that they agree with you on. Of course, the partisans are going to support their team, but look. Here's one of the things about the Lindsey Graham bill, which I know. Definitely goes against anything Republicans have thought about this issue, which it belongs at the state level. That I think could have been a positive, if it got off the ground, is that the debate right now that we're having is all about banning abortion. And the reality is, in most of these cases that are popping up in the states, it's a 15-week ban, it's a 16-week ban, it's a 12-week ban, it's a 21-week ban. That was the law in a lot of states before this. So. The situation in Kansas was just the status quo, which was, another version of, a point in which after there was viability, you couldn't have an abortion. And so Republicans do need to have a debate about what does the third trimester look like, because that's an area where they win on this issue.
Eugene, the other thing that there's been some, are the Republicans talking enough about what they're going to do if they get control? And is that holding them back?
That's been one of the biggest criticisms of Republicans when it comes to the inflation issue. I mean, especially if you look at some of the, more conservative MAGA Republicans who are saying Biden is doing this, Biden is doing that, Democrats, your housing, your rent and your groceries, your gas, but they haven't put forward legislation or ideas or just policies that say this is going to improve your situation if you vote for us. And that is something I think voters are paying attention to.
Dasha, what does Oz say he wants to do when he gets elected?
That's a great question. He's talking to the points that the Republican Party has put out there. I mean, talking about crime, talking about the economy. Concrete policy, though, I think is still a real question mark. And it's interesting. I was in New Hampshire this week covering the primary there, and I was talking to voters as they were coming out. I was asking who they were voting for, but I was also asking them about the future of the party. Right? Do you want it to go more toward the MAGA side of things? Do you want it to go back to moderate Republicanism? And how much of a role does Trump still play? And I was surprised by how many people who voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020 said, you know what, I think it's time to move on. I think maybe we look at a DeSantis, and I think you're starting to see some Republican candidates now. I mean,
we've been here before.
We've been here before.
We've been here before. In fact, we got one of the interesting things in our poll coming on Sunday is, here we go again. Is this really the beginning of the end? We'll see, right, with him. Like it's like he's in one of these lows. And it's like, is this the moment that he never doesn't recover? Again, we've all been. Let me end with immigration. And do you believe, I'm going to ask each of you this, do you believe there is a section of persuadable voters where the immigration issue hurts you? And then same question from the other perspective.
I think immigration is not a top issue for battleground voters. It is a top issue for your far right and for the Republican base. I think that Democrats, the scenes right now of dropping people off and the Trump-like tactics and stunts, I do think that ends up showing the contrast between Republicans and Democrats. That Democrats,
what about the fact that a Democratic mayor of El Paso is doing this?
I think that if you are talking to a lot of border mayors, what they will tell you is we need more funding for this. And it's not Joe Biden's fault. It is Congress's fault. They need to act and do something about it. And so as long as we see a Joe Biden and a White House that is aggressively doing that contrast like they have in the last 24 hours, instead of hiding from the issue of immigration, then we will be fine on immigration.
Sarah, the polling suggests that immigration's not, it's certainly a concern of persuadable voters, but it's never their top concern. Those that it's the top concern are sort of already in your camp.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. You know, the one, you know, thing that I think does cross current and helps Republicans to the degree if they do it thoughtfully and appropriately is that we've seen crime go up in so many of these cities. And when immigration gets linked to crime for voters, I think that is a place where, in my view, if it's done tactfully and appropriately, that it does, you know, people will look at a Republican and say, you're stronger. I'm worried about this. This can be part of a challenge with some immigration.
Let me ask you guys this very quickly. If you're Greg Abbott, are you happy that Ron DeSantis did what he did? Or are you like, oh, he just made it a little harder for me?
As a Texan, I would say he is probably very annoyed right now.
What would you say?
Look, I don't know that he is for it or against it. I mean, it was something Texas did. So
no, and I understand. Like, you know, Abbott has been sending him to New York and D.C., and you can make a case. Well, you know, maybe they wanted to go to New York or D.C. I'm just wondering, did DeSantis turn it into a stunt, and it's not what Abbott wanted?
Yeah, I think. Look, at the end of the day, the country's policy, because of this administration, is that there is an open border, and these governors, I think, have every right to consider sharing responsibility around the country.
Well, are we going to see that, by the way? Because DHS wants to do this.
Huh?
DHS wants to start taking over these flights.
Well, I think what you'll see is that right now there needs to be an asylum system, and that there's a difference. There is not an open border. There are people trying to seek asylum, and they're trying to come up with a process to do that.
I will tell you, though, for voters, in New Hampshire could not be farther from the U.S.-Mexico border. It is the issue I heard over and over again, and I think
in a Republican party.
But I think it could be the abortion of the Republicans when you're talking about an issue that could turn people out. People get fired up about this.
I think it's on. And New Hampshire has always been red hot on the right on immigration. Anyway, Eugene, Xochitl, Sara, and Dasha, thank you all for getting us started. Coming up, a judge blocks the Justice Department's request to get a quick end to the special master in order to get access to roughly 100 classified documents that they seized from Mar-a-Lago. So there is a special master now to the case. What does this mean for the investigation? How long does this delay things? We'll have a report after this. Plus, a grim discovery in a recaptured Ukrainian city. Hundreds of graves, mass graves, found just days after the Russians left. We're live in Kharkiv. Welcome back. Right now, we are awaiting word from the Justice Department about whether it will formally appeal the judge's appointment of a special master to oversee documents seized from Mar-a-Lago. They certainly said they would be okay with the special master the judge ended up picking. That judge, Aileen Cannon, did reject the Justice Department's request for a stay to her previous motion. And that blocked the Justice Department's request to immediately access a cache of classified documents that they obtained during last month's search of former President Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate. Now, the judge also named Raymond Dearie. This is a senior U.S. district judge from New York as special master to review all of the material taken from Mar-a-Lago. Trump's lawyers had proposed Dearie as a potential special master earlier this week, and the Justice Department signaled its approval for him as a neutral third-party arbiter. So, I'm joined now by our Justice and Intelligence correspondent, Ken Delaney, and also joined by Bradley Moss, an attorney who specializes in national security. So, Ken, let me start with you. And sort of this confusion here of what Justice is doing, are they going to appeal? Are they both going to sort of cooperate and appeal? Is that essentially what they're doing here?
Yeah, Chuck, I expect the Justice Department to appeal this order in its entirety. That's what they signaled they would do a while ago when they filed a notice with the 11th Circuit. I also expect them to ask this circuit to do exactly what they asked this judge to do, which is to put a temporary stay on just this narrow part of her order that has to do with the classified documents, because that's where their interest is the strongest. The executive branch comes into court and says, this is a national security issue. We need these classified documents. Generally, the courts defer to that. This judge did not, but generally the courts do. And so that seems to be what they care about most. They want access to the 100 classified documents that they seized at Mar-a-Lago now to use in their criminal investigation. Right. Now, the judge threw them a couple of bones and said, well, hey, you can still continue to use them in your national security damage assessment. You can even have the FBI help out. You can even have the FBI ask questions about these documents without using their content. But that isn't enough for the Justice Department. And so I do anticipate that they will appeal, even as they go through this master process, because that's the way it works. They'll continue to do what the judge has asked them to do while they appeal.
This November 30th deadline, I know that, Ken, the justice wanted it moved up. At the end of the day, is it that much of a delay, 2 months? Is November 30th mean justice can pick right back up where they are once it's done?
Yeah, I think so. I think this ends up being just a speed bump rather than a roadblock, especially because the judge directed the special master to review the classified documents first. So even if they don't get the say, even if they don't win on appeal, it seems like they'll get those classified documents rather quickly. And it's not clear how much they care about the rest of the documents that they seized from Donald Trump's office and from the storage room. So the master will go about his business. The only weird thing about what the judge has asked the master to do is this idea that he can review things for executive privilege. Yeah. There's no precedent for that, and it's not clear what law he's going to apply to that, and that could take some time, and potentially beyond November. But again, it's not really clear that it matters in terms of the FBI's criminal investigation, which involves talking to witnesses just as much as it involves these documents.
Yeah, so Bradley Moss, tell me in your expert opinion, how much is it just set back the Justice Department's timeline a little bit, or is it more damaging?
No, I mean, it's strictly a delay tactic, which is a very typical Trump thing to do here. He's just trying to push everything off for a while and delay an eventual indictment with the hope that if the indictment ultimately comes, he can then use pretrial motions to delay a trial, get it all the way to November 2024, and either he or someone favorable to him would get elected and shut this all down. What Ken was saying was very true. There's no real precedent to have a special master do some of this work, especially with the documents with classification markings. I do not know, and the special master order didn't clarify, I don't know what this person is truly going to be able to do other than look at the documents, say, okay, I see classification markings. What am I supposed to do with that? Trump team's going to say, well, we declassified him. He goes, great. None of the 3 statutes at issue that were the basis for the search warrant have anything to do with whether or not the documents were classified. It's about the classification markings, and they're still there, and they're still valid. What am I supposed to do here?
Is there any chance, Bradley, that because he runs into this, okay, now what am I supposed to do with this, that the judge intervenes and somehow is able to delay this process further?
Well, whatever he ultimately concludes, and it's certainly possible that the special master will go to the Trump team and say, okay, these classification markings are valid. Present an argument to me of why you would potentially have any right to have these back, even if you were declassified. Whatever the ultimate recommendation that comes from the special master, it then goes to Judge Cannon. She's not bound by it. She can overrule it. And whatever she concludes, especially on this issue of, 1, if the classification markings are valid, and 2, if there's any possessory right for Donald Trump in them, which I can't fathom there would be, whatever she concludes, if she rules against Donald Trump, he can then appeal that, which again, this is just a delay tactic, which is why doing this in a pre-indictment phase like this for such an unprecedented type of review is extraordinary. And that's why justice is appealing already to the 11th Circuit.
Is there an argument to be made, Bradley, that this is actually, look, justice already knows they have their case. They know what they're prosecuting. Fine, you want to do this. This is only going to give justice more credibility over time. Fair?
I certainly think it's fair, and I certainly do more or less agree. I think they've already got the case. I think they were dotting the I's and crossing the T's with this search warrant. They were verifying not just the unlawful retention of these documents, which was bad enough on its own. They wanted to go at him with the obstruction. That was the cream on the top of the cake. They wanted all of it, and that's what they got with these documents proving the obstruction. But now they need to wait out this process, go to the special master, so they can have the full range of evidence to present to the grand jury and proceed for an indictment.
Ken, is Bradley's theory something that is whispered about at the Justice Department?
100%. Bradley's a very smart lawyer. He knows what's going on here. Yeah, I agree with him completely. And I think that Well, I would say this. They're still investigating, right? They're talking to everybody who knows anything about how these documents were transported, who saw them, what Donald Trump knew about it, what was he doing with them. Those are all really relevant facts that the FBI may not have a 100% handle on yet and is still asking questions about. But the question of did they possess them and was there a lie told about no classified documents being at Mar-a-Lago, that seems to be a pretty open and shut question at this moment.
Yeah, this is, perhaps this is why justice is taking its sweet time to actually file their appeal. Anyway, Ken Delaney and Bradley Moss helping bring some clarity to what is a complicated story to follow at times. So thank you. Up next.
Anytime.
The atrocities of war. Ukrainian authorities stumble upon a mass grave site. Hundreds of corpses. They're probably mostly civilian. We're on the ground in Kharkiv for this gruesome discovery. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Experts and law enforcement officers in Ukraine have begun the difficult work of having to exhume a mass grave of bodies. It was found in the forest in the recently liberated town of Izyum. As we show you these pictures from the scene, we want to warn you that some of these images are truly disturbing and could be triggering. So if you want to look away, please do. President Zelensky said over 400 bodies have been found at the mass burial site. According to the governor of the Kharkiv region, 99% of the bodies exhumed so far have showed signs of a violent death. Some bodies appear to have their hands tied behind their backs. One person was reportedly buried with a rope around his neck. The mass grave in Izyum follows a disturbing pattern. We've seen similar mass burial sites found after Ukrainian troops liberated Bucha, Irpin, and Mariupol. These are real war crimes. Erin McLaughlin is in the region. She joins me from Kharkiv now. And Erin, I remember after Bucha, there was a lot of momentum in the West of making sure we're going to chronicle all of this, and war crimes are going to get prosecuted at some point and at some time. Are you hearing that same conversation now?
Well, certainly we're hearing that from Ukrainian authorities. They have a whole team of prosecutors here in Kharkiv that are doggedly pursuing each and every alleged war crime, and they're out there today in Izyum exhuming more than 400 bodies, many of them civilians, many of them, according to Ukrainian officials, the bodies of children. And they are comparing this to the atrocities of Bucha and Mariupol. The difference between Izyum and what we saw unfold in Bucha is that Bucha was liberated after a month of Russian occupation. Izyum was occupied for 6 months, and the scale of the devastation seems to be that much greater than the horrors that unfolded in Bucha. So they certainly do have a lot to do. They certainly have a high hill, if you will, to climb in terms of trying to prosecute and hold Russian soldiers accountable, as Ukrainian officials have vowed to hold every single Russian soldier who has committed an atrocity here in Ukraine accountable for their war crimes. That being said, the Kremlin has come out issuing a denial, calling this discovery of this mass grave fake. President Zelensky, though, for his part, saying that Russia needs to be held responsible. Chuck.
Erin, we're also learning a little bit about what life was like for some of these Russian soldiers who were doing the actual occupying. They left some letters. We've seen reports of that. We're also hearing stories from Ukrainians that were having to live under the occupation of what they learned. Tell me some of the things you've learned over the last 48 hours as these stories have started to circulate.
Yeah, we were out today in a village not far from Izyum speaking to some of the local residents. We spoke to one man who described what it was like living under 6 months of Russian occupation. He said it was absolutely terrifying. They cut electricity to his village. They cut water supply. He had to find alternate ways to get water to survive. They also cut internet and cell phone connectivity. So there was no way for him to reliably communicate with his children in the outside world. He was stuck there with his wife. He described the moments to me with tears in his eyes when Ukrainian soldiers finally made the push into the village village. He said that the Russian soldiers simply ran away. They left as quickly as they could, destroying everything in their wake, including his village's bridge. But he said he was so relieved to see the sight of those Ukrainian soldiers, to know that he was finally free. And that relief, of course, is in stark contrast to the mourning that's now taking place in the area, with more than 400 bodies found in that mass grave. Chuck.
Yeah, relief, tragedy, all of the horrible parts of war becoming front-facing. Aaron McLaughlin on the ground for us. Thank you, and of course, please stay safe. After the break, the White House calls out Republican governors and clashes with its own Homeland Security Department as thousands of migrants cross the border every day. The latest on the growing issue and the U.S. response. Next. Welcome back. Some of the migrants sent to Martha's Vineyard by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis are leaving the island today for a new temporary shelter on Cape Cod. Massachusetts Republican Governor Charlie Baker announced he was activating up to 125 members of the state's National Guard to help coordinate the voluntary move. In addition to reaction from mainly Democratic officials who are accusing DeSantis of using migrants as political props, the move also raised questions over the legality of his actions after reports that the group of largely Venezuelan migrants had been misled about where they were heading. In a press conference yesterday, the U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts said she was looking into this deception.
We are looking into that case, and we'll be speaking with members of the Department of Justice. Massachusetts isn't the only place where this has happened. We have several other sister communities, whether it's D.C., New York, California, where we've seen things like this, and we're hoping to get some input from the Department of Justice about what our next steps might be, if any at all.
Meanwhile, on a press conference today, Governor DeSantis said the migrants were transported voluntarily. He told reporters they signed a release form and were given a packet that included a map of Martha's Vineyard. So, if a crime was committed here, or if a law was broken, what is it? So joining me now is Sarah Sherman-Stokes, a clinical associate professor of law at Boston University and the associate director of the school's Immigrant Rights and Human Trafficking Clinic. So let me start with this. There's a separate issue of whether the governor broke his own law in Florida. That, I'm going to set that aside. I'm well aware of that. That's a state law. But this was across state lines, deceiving people to get on a plane. What law could he have broken here on the federal level?
Thank you, Chuck, and thank you so much for having me and for covering this issue. I mean, look, folks are throwing around all kinds of legal terminology, words that have really significant legal meaning, like trafficking, kidnapping, smuggling, harboring. I think, quite frankly, we don't have enough information at the moment to determine whether a law has been broken. As you noted, Rachel Rollins, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Massachusetts, is investigating the legality of DeSantis' actions. And Gavin Newsom has called for the Department of Justice to investigate as well. And I'm glad there's an investigation, and I look forward to hearing the results.
You know, it's been interesting. The governor of Texas sort of tried to draw a distinction between what he's done versus what Governor DeSantis did. And I think in some ways you could argue there is a pretty bright line. One is an actual political stunt. You know, the other there might have been people that said, hey, I've got family in New York. Do you want a bus ticket to New York? Yes, I'll take a bus ticket to New York. Is it different what Governor Abbott's doing versus what Governor DeSantis did?
I mean, look, I think it's fair to say that their actions both come from an anti-immigrant place, playing politics with people's lives. People that have families, they came to the United States for what we all want, a better future for our children, safety, stability. And you have governors using, immigrants to score political points and hope for re-election. And I think we need to call it what it is. It's racist, it's inhumane, and it's immoral.
Let's talk about what needs to be done. DHS and the White House are apparently at odds over. DHS is ready to start, hey, maybe we ought to take some of these folks from the southern border, bring them up to some other states, some relocation. Not an unusual thing. We've done this in the past. Do you think the federal government should be stepping in here and doing this and not allowing all the governors to sort of take this into their own hands?
Well, look, I think there's no question that our current immigration system is broken. And so do we need something better than what we currently have? Absolutely. The situation faced by folks at the border has been despicable for years. People are in dangerous and inhumane situations. They don't have the legal support or the social support that they need. And so to the extent that we can provide them more support legally in their communities, then great, all the better. But my concern is that we do that in a way that is humane and with the full consent of the immigrants who are coming here to seek safety.
And so in that sense, if it is a federal government program, that's one thing. You don't think the state governors should be doing this on their own?
I'll say this, Chuck. I don't trust the state governors to make decisions in the best interests of the immigrants and their families. From what we've seen so far, they are not acting in the interests of these families. They're acting for pure political gain.
Let me ask specifically to go back. The migrants that Governor DeSantis sent to Martha's Vineyard were Venezuelan, are Venezuelan. We have a policy. We don't deport folks back to Venezuela because of the current situation there. Do they have more legal standing than some of these other migrants in this country?
I don't think it's particularly useful to sort of pit groups of migrants against one another to think about, who deserves more or who has more rights. The bottom line is that all immigrants deserve better standing in this country and to be afforded a pathway to lawful status. Immigrants that have come here seeking safety and protection, whether or not we're going to deport them at the end of the day, that could change depending on who's in power. But at the end of the day, is legal assistance. They need a place to stay, place to send their kids to school, and they need.
No, I understand that, but do Venezuelans, there's Venezuelans that were here before a previous state do have protected status. If we're not, sending people back to their home country right now, do they have a different status than other migrants? That's all I was asking there, legally.
I would say I'll give you the legal answer, which is it depends.
Okay.
When we can't deport people, that's true. Sometimes they get to stay, but they're really in limbo. They don't have a pathway to permanent status.
Right.
And it's not stable for them.
No, it's arguably the worst possible outcome in some ways because they're literally homeless, countryless. Anyway, Professor Sarah Stokes from Boston University, really appreciate you sharing your perspective and expertise. I want to turn now to the White House. Some political stories there where some of the president's top aides are already looking past 2022 and they're getting ready for 2024. NBC's latest reporting shows Biden's top advisors have begun quietly building a campaign operation. Be prepared, as you will, as Biden and his advisors use this year's midterms to test themes and messaging for a re-election bid in 2024, should the president decide to do it. And the behind-the-scenes movement is the latest data point that Biden does, in fact, plan to run again, even as members of his own party have questioned whether he should. Joining me now is one of my colleagues that were on this story. It's NBC's White House correspondent, Carol Lee. So, Carol, I guess the question is this Joe Biden's reelect, or is this people around Joe Biden's preparing for Joe Biden's reelect, if you get my drift?
Yeah, that is a great question, Chuck. And look, we're told that the president is involved in these discussions, and obviously he gets weekly polling updates and he's aware of what's going on. But what's interesting about this setup where the DNC would basically be the bulk of a campaign operation, it would handle the money, it would have the state's ground game, and they would have the very small actual presidential campaign operation. A skeletal staff was how someone described it to us. It has its advantages in terms of financial advantages, and there's a ready-to-go, team there, hundreds of people who work there, a press shop, a war room, all of those things, and it gives the president some flexibility to make that final decision, which the First Lady told NBC earlier this week that they hadn't had that family conversation yet. So it has all those advantages. But at the same time, to your point, it sort of looks like a going through the motions effort, in the sense that if the president decides to run, it's there. If he doesn't, well, it's all there for somebody else.
Who's in charge here? Is this Jen O'Malley Dillon? Is this, is that who it is?
Yeah, so in terms of a campaign manager or chair,
whatever you want to call
name comes up, yes, but they haven't decided that. And frankly, a lot of that depends on the midterms, according to the people we talk to, because if Democrats pull it out and they maintain control, Biden has such a small circle of advisors that he's not really inclined to give any of them up to go to a campaign, particularly a relatively small campaign, because he's going to then have a legislative agenda. If Republicans take control, that's a different story, and the campaign could ramp up faster.
I tell you, we haven't had a DNC or an RNC that involved in a reelect. I guess you could say Bush 04. It was pretty involved in Clinton 96, but Obama, he didn't care much for using the DNC. Carol Lee, Thank you. Still to come, indefensible. That's the word the NBA commissioner used after a damning report found the owner of the Phoenix Suns conducting himself inappropriately and used racist and misogynistic language in the workplace. So why is he still allowed to own a team? Welcome back. There is mounting pressure on Phoenix Suns owner Robert Sarver to essentially resign or sell his team in the wake of an NBA investigation that found he used racial slurs, sexist language, engaged in bullying behavior, and fostered, in short, a hostile work environment. The team's vice chairman, John Najafi, released a statement himself late yesterday calling for Sarver to resign from his ownership of the team. And today, a key sponsor, PayPal, which is the logo sponsor sewn in under the Suns jerseys, they don't plan to renew their sponsorship if the team is still owned by Sarver when the season begins. The NBA has suspended Sarver for 1 year and fined him $10 million, but the league is facing scrutiny for not making the penalty harsher. Joined now by the Reverend Al Sharpton. He's, of course, president of the National Action Network, host of Politics Nation on MSNBC, and he's among those calling for Robert Sarver, the owner of the Phoenix Suns, to be removed. Rev, here's the head scratcher to me on this decision by the NBA is they came out with the exact, if you would have told me they're going to have the exact same punishment for an owner that the NFL came out for Dan Snyder and the Washington football team for arguably very, in some ways, similar culture issues, I just said, that's not Adam Silver. He's not going to do that. And given the reaction of the players, did he whiff on this?
I do. I think he did. And I've had a pretty decent relationship with Adam Silver, but I was surprised that he would come with such a soft and in my opinion, less than adequate decision. Here's a man who categorically used the N-word, categorically dealt in misogynist exchanges with people in the team. So are we saying now that just giving him a pat on the hand, a slap of the wrist, and you can pay your way with $10 million for the right to engage in that kind of behavior, even when he was told he shouldn't use that? I think that it's normalizing racism and misogyny, and it should not be allowed in the culture.
What's the difference between Donald Sterling and Robert Sarver in your mind?
I think the difference is that with Donald Sterling, people rose up more indignant. And I think that though we were out there in National Action Network, a lot of people didn't believe it was necessary because they felt Adam Silver would do what he did with Don Sterling. Now you're seeing a lot of people, after it was brought out, from LeBron James across the board coming out. I wish they'd come out when we did months ago.
You know, the Suns are very well connected inside the NBA. The former owner, Jerry Colangelo, big with USA Basketball, also in Phoenix. Do you think that had something to do with it?
I think that did have something to do with it. And I think that first of all, this investigation took forever. And I think there was a lot of inside play based on their having a lot of juice there. But I think the backlash they're getting, they did not think that players would come out. We're seeing today PayPal is saying that they will not renew their contract. And we're going to put a lot of pressure on everyone else. We're also looking into the fact that there were public funds used for the Suns to build their stadium. And we will probably be entering into the courts to deal with that with some taxpayers there in Arizona.
What would you like to see Chris Paul and Devin Booker, two very prominent members of the Phoenix Suns, big followings, Chris Paul, well-respected inside the league. What would you like to see the two of them do?
I'd like to see them take a stand and say that they do not feel that it is fair that they are being forced to play for someone that would use such racist and misogynist terms and behavior, and that the association ought to be protecting them from having to work for someone like that, not putting them in a position where if they violate their contract, they could be sued by somebody that can call them any name, racist or misogynist, that he wants.
You've had to push the leagues, multiple leagues, quite a bit. Look, the owners run these leagues, and isn't that what we just learned with the NBA? I think Adam Silver probably would like to have done more, but he's not in charge.
And I think that that is probably the tragedy. I think we've got to look at the fact that should we allow owners to have that kind of grip on the league and use public funds in order to do it. I think what people don't understand is that they go and use public dollars, taxpayer dollars, to build these stadiums and to get all kinds of tax abatement. So they can't act like, well, this is my domain. What does the public have to do with it? When the public is financing their stadiums, the public is making adjustments for them for everything from security with policing across the board. You can't go to the public and ask for certain things and then at the end of the day tell the public I'm going to live by my own rules.
No, look, if you choose to be a sports owner, you have chosen to be a member of a civic community, and you've chosen to be a custodian for how that community acts and behaves. This is not a private business. Anyway, Reverend Sharpton, we're both busy. I know we're both up against it. Always a pleasure to get your perspective on these things. Thank you.
Always good to talk with you, Chuck.
Thank you, Rev. And thank you all for being with us this hour.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.